context. So first of all, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to both our overseas speakers, Elizabeth and Polly, and also to my colleagues from Social Work Department, Anna and Edward, who'll be speaking to us today. First up, we have Dr. Elizabeth Gilchrist, who is a professor and a registered forensic psychologist in the School of Health and Life Sciences at Glasgow Caledonian University. Her primary research interest is in the area of domestic violence with a particular focus on risk assessment. She's been involved in training postgraduate forensic psychologists since 1996 and is a member of various forensic and professional committees within the British Psychological Society. She's also widely recognized as an expert in the area of child protection, domestic violence, and as a member of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. And most importantly, she wears various hats, including sitting as chair currently of the Parole Board in Scotland. And so she's got access to perpetrators and victims and has a very, very sound and strong understanding of what some of the areas we need to be looking into are and what kind of tools we need to be equipped with to do our work better. She'll be speaking to us this morning about culture and IPV, discussing 3 studies into the roles of alcohol, parenting, and culture in families experiencing IPV. Let's welcome Professor Gilchrist.
I'm just hoping we'll get... Brilliant. Well, good morning, and I'm delighted to be here. I've got to say that the seminar series we've been involved in has been absolutely fascinating and incredibly helpful in terms of developing links, ideas, and refining theory. I have quite an ambitious task in some ways in terms of I want to touch on 3 studies that I've been involved in directing through the university in Glasgow, but also to make a few points in terms of practitioner implications, because one of the things I think, as Pooja has said, is that I'm an academic, but I'm also a practitioner, and I have a sort of a duty, I think, to try and translate some of the academic information for practice in terms of implications for how we structure services and how we work within services. So one of the first things, just a really quick definition I wanted to put up is, this is one of the United Nations definitions of domestic violence, which is clearly highlighting the gender base and gender equality, and looking at structural issues as well as individual definitions. So I'd like to emphasise that for me it's really important to move away from seeing domestic violence as being an issue of psychopathology within an individual, and so to then reconceptualise it at a number of different levels. So within family systems, within cultures, within social structures, and within wide cultural understandings of the roles of men and women, families, fathers, mothers and children. And I actually think it's beyond culture in the sense of our ethnic identities or our nationalities. It's a culture in a far broader sense. So I'm going to problematise Scottish mainstream culture as well as other cultures. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll maybe understand with me why I think we need to really think this way, because it has very important implications for interventions and where we locate those interventions and how we link them. So in terms of Scotland, we do have high rates of intimate partner violence. Our population is around about 5.5 million, so less than a Hong Kong population. But we have good reporting. We have a police force that prioritise domestic abuse as one of the really high focus. And the reason they'd done that was because they had identified that it was the area they were doing a lot of work on and making no difference. We've challenged some of our gang-related violence, our young people's violence. We've made a difference. We continue to have this high level, 60,000 plus incidents per year of domestic abuse within a small population, and that is the ones recorded by the police. What we also have is that it is gendered in Scotland. We have a gendered definition in Scotland. 80% of the incidents are reported perpetrated by males on females. And of the other 20, it's not necessarily, I know we're going to talk about male victims later, but indeed it's not necessarily that we have male victims and perpetrated by females. We have a lot of male on male violence and female on female violence. which I think is an area that has been even less explored. We also, I think we know that there's a co-occurrence of abuses in terms of domestic abuse, so adult to adult and adult to child violence. In Scotland, at the minimum, the lowest level of estimation is that 38% of the incidents there are children present. So children present in the house and aware of the incidents going on. We have a really high link with alcohol in our recorded incidents. And in fact, if we go to our prison populations, even higher. So almost 60% of cases, people were intoxicated. And most often that was the perpetrator. About a third of the time it was perpetrator and victim. Very rarely was it the victim only. And there were some interesting interplays between when the children were present and the victim was drunk, in the sense that mothers tended not to have been drinking if their children were present. So there were some interesting stories to be told, because implicit within some of our practice is that some people think that it's difficult families, it's chaotic families, it's substance misuse. There's a drunken mother who's failing to protect her child. And they're all drinking together. And that's not the story within the pictures of the incidents that we were seeing, that actually mum was remaining sober to protect the child whilst dad was coming home drunk. So some interesting things that we really need to challenge. In terms of minority ethnic groups, and this is by ethnicity rather than anything else, looking at the Scottish Government, 2009, the Scottish Government said that there was very little information as to the experiences of minority ethnic women. And this is in a society where we have a duty to record, and we record in every walk of life issues to do with our identities, to do with gender, to do with equalities. We have strong laws in terms of equalities, and yet somehow or other we don't know about the experiences of minority ethnic women, and even less about minority ethnic men. The only thing that they note, and if I could draw your attention to this, is that they do know that from the work that has been undertaken, there are special issues and complexities when you end up with multiple identities. So going forward, we also know that traditional interventions don't tend to work. We have 20 to 30% recidivism within 6 months of perpetrators going through traditional groups. We know that there's a high comorbidity of substance misuse, other issues, child abuse, and we do know that these multiple social identities, and particularly deprived identities, so excluded or marginalised identities, make things worse. So we need to consider multiple identities and multiple levels. This is my favourite model. I've become a big fan of the nested ecological model, or the bioecological model, or socio-ecological model of many, many areas. So in terms of, I don't know if it's a model you're familiar with, the idea that you have multiple layers that affect development of an individual, they affect people's interactions within society, they affect how we conceptualize our problems, they affect how we structure our interventions. So at the very heart, you have an individual who has their own personality, age, sex, gender, etc. Health needs, strengths, resilience, coping strategies. Next to that, there's a microsystem of influences in terms of the immediate social environment of peers, friends, school, and family. Religious communities, though, also important, neighbourhood and things like that. You then have an ecosystem of economic structures, of government, of local structures, and perhaps subcultural values, so that within the UK society, certainly we have majority cultures, we have minority cultures, and we have different structures and different access to structures depending on where you sit within that. And then at the macro system level, if we came back to sort of maybe a patriarchal explanation, the sort of cultural values in terms of big concepts about gender, about ethnicity, are huge in terms of how we understand ourselves and how culturally, we have cultural norms that we accept. They generally are the majority cultural norms, and they are influential in law, in access to social justice, in health, and even how we understand ourselves. So the idea of a person as a system with a number of different features and a number of different aspects at different levels that impinge on them developmentally, but also access to services, is really important to me. So in terms of also what we know, this is me as a psychologist talking, we know that strengths-based interventions work better because people engage with them better when their values are listened to and met, where the intervention accords with our value system. and where things are delivered in such a way that it can be accessed. And that could be levels of intellectual ability, it could be cultural values, it could be learning styles, so visual learner, auditory learner, etc. One size does not fit all. We can't give programmatic interventions to a group of people who have, on average, certain needs, because pretty much nobody in the room would be the average person. So we generally bland out what would make it meaningful to the groups, the people in the room. We also know that the interventions have to be targeted. So we need to understand our populations. So we need to focus on some of the deficits, some of the risks and needs, but do it in such a way that we're focusing also on the strengths that people bring and fostering things like resilience. The facilitators need to be good, they need to be trained, they need to understand the group that they're working with so that they can deliver in a responsive manner. And one of the things coming out of counselling psychology is one of the biggest influences on how effective an intervention is the therapeutic alliance between the person delivering the programme and the individuals in the room. Now, if you think about cultural barriers, language barriers, difference and a lack of or a misunderstanding of those differences, you can understand that we, without good understandings from our data and that translated into training, we will get nowhere because we're talking at different languages. We could be talking past one another rather than to one another. It needs to be delivered in a culturally sensitive way, in an appropriate way, and that's not just about what we would talk about being politically correct. It's about making things effective. So what do we know about domestic abuse? I'm briefly going to touch on these 3 studies and give you little snapshots of some of what people have said about them, and hopefully at the end you'll come back to being able to see why the interventions need to be focused in a particular way and some of the key things that we do need to address. So we know heavy drinkers are more likely to be involved in violence. So people who have heavy drugs usage, heavy substance use, not necessarily an addictions model though, and I would highlight that it doesn't necessarily have to be a medical addictions model. Alcohol is often present as a risk factor in terms of a risk factor. This is when it's going to occur, when somebody is intoxicated, rather than a chronic risk factor. So it's a dynamic risk factor in terms of when the violence may occur and how severe the violence might be, but not necessarily that it is going to happen. So this is why I'm talking about there is a direct effect of alcohol in terms of intoxication, indirect effects in terms of present, emotionally present, other stressors, focusing on accessing substances rather than family life. And a spurious effect, maybe it's present in people who struggle to cope. So maybe anger, pro-coping, avoidant coping and drinking coexist. But there's also a multiple thresholds model, which I think is very useful. So for some people, for them to be abusive within their relationship, for them to be violent, then alcohol has to be present. In fact, it may mean that they have to be intoxicated. For others, then the violence is likely to occur. So people who are higher perhaps on antisocial personality, people who have other beliefs about entitlement, narcissism, etc., within their relationship linked to that. And the alcohol may be present, but it may be nothing to do with the actual risk of this happening. So we did one study looking at the roles of alcohol. We were interested in how victims maybe coped using alcohol, how perpetrators used alcohol, how non-perpetrators used alcohol, and also the presence or absence of alcohol use and difficult alcohol use within conflictual couples rather than abusive couples. So thinking about the macro system, so we've got cultural values at the highest level. In Scotland, certainly, there's a high tolerance that it's a drinking culture. It's something people do. It's how people relax. It's how people socialise. Not drinking sometimes can be a problem within a Scottish culture. If you wish to go and socialise, then actually not taking the alcoholic drink would see you as odd. But we also have some other beliefs. So these guys are talking. So this is guys within prison talking about their use of alcohol and their conflicts in relationships. The first participant is saying, there's nothing else to do. My girlfriend and I, if we're planning something else, or she's got her wee girl at the weekend and didn't go to the grands, then they wouldn't drink. So this is something I would think about as about exposure of children to alcohol. There are some choices there. But if they're on their own and drinking, or, you know, socialising, that is what they would do. They would drink. That was what it was. And one of the interesting things is they talk about minimum pricing. So it's only £15 for a bottle of vodka, and that would be a good way of socialising. Other things were too expensive. So some of the social, sporting, cultural activities were too expensive. I'm sorry that the bottom is cut off with this one, but another participant is saying it'd be the weekend, we would explode, we'd end up having too much to drink, we'd argue every weekend. So there was a pattern of, as they were doing downtime, they would drink. They would know that it was a risk factor for them to argue because that's what they did, but drinking was part of the culture. At an individual level, I think our participants were brutally honest with themselves and with us in a hilarious way in some ways. So one of the guys in prison was saying to us, I think I'm a genius when I'm drunk. I think I know everything. I can be very patronising. And one of the things of what he has said is that I think moves away from a notion of drunken, intoxicated, problematic drinking just in terms of violence exploding, is it really taps into this, I can be very patronising. He was really saying that he would have this higher sense of entitlement. He was drunk, he knew everything, people should listen to him. So it was coming back to a notion of control about, my needs and my understandings and what do you know? And there was definitely a hierarchical structure within that. Another young man is saying that it changes him when he's been drinking. He gets hyper. When he's sober, he's a quiet, shy wee boy. He, to an extent, I think, was drinking more as an enabler to engage in social conversations. But again, it gave him this sense of power. He could go and do things he wouldn't otherwise be able to do. The third participant, who basically talks about I've got morals and priorities when I'm sober. When I'm drunk, I'll just have a carry on. And basically he was talking about sexual infidelity, that he, when he was drunk and out with his partner, would go and talk and chat up all sorts of other girls and indeed go home with them. So his entitlement to sexual activity and his actual links to his partner and the care he had for his partner were totally broken down when he was drinking. But he also knew this. It was almost like he was giving himself permission under the influence of alcohol to make choices that he wasn't prepared to face when he was sober. In terms of drinking families, drinking together was seen as a positive in some ways, but there was a sense that it facilitated conversation, which was excellent. But as our participant, the first participant we interviewed in prison says, after a couple of cans, you start to open up more. Or she's had a couple of vodkas and you start talking. I don't know, one thing leads to another, something gets mentioned and it sparks. It triggers it. Now, he just thought that alcohol was the trigger. It triggers it off, and one of us goes in a rant, it gets louder, and it quietens down. And what are we arguing for is what he says. Well, he's been convicted of domestic abuses and in prison, so it doesn't quieten down that quickly. It tends to quieten down when the police arrive. His level of abuse was actually quite high, and the level of violence was high. So there is something about, that ongoing minimisation of violence. But he was saying, it's the alcohol. And I would be saying that it's their conflict resolution style and many other things within that relationship facilitated by alcohol, but it was a routine activity. And I think the last point I want to highlight is within the Scottish culture, we have a really interesting gendered view of drinking. So we asked the participants, this was men and women, but I'm talking about the male participants here, what did they think about women drinking? And actually they had some really strong views that women shouldn't drink in the same way, that drunken women were a problem, that drunken victims were to blame, whilst their excuse for men was that drunken men were less at fault and drunken victims were more at fault. And I would sort of say, if we're highlighting the different ways we think of identities and where we locate the issue, certainly in Scotland, we've located substance misuse as an addictions problem and a problem of an individual. And I would say, well, as a cultural level, at a family level, at an ecosystem level, we really do have an issue. Because women should be more caring, so they shouldn't drink. They should be more conscious, and especially with all the children. So they're making reference to their status as mothers. And bear in mind what I said, that our data shows that mothers don't drink over the weekend when their children are present. Dads do. I don't like women drinking pints. It doesn't seem right. A lot of them now, it disgusts us, these lassies talking horribly. Lassies is Scots for women, talking horribly. I'm a bit old-fashioned in that way. He did have traditional views in some senses, and he was quite happy to apply them to what he thought of drunken women, which was quite interesting. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move to the next study briefly. And this is a PhD study that I'm supervising. My student works as an advocate and support worker in an area, a specialist service for minority ethnic women who have experienced domestic abuse in Scotland. Often these women have unstable status in terms of their immigration status. Many of the women have come from the Indian subcontinent on spousal visas to marry Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi men within the Scottish culture. These men tend to be first, second, third generation immigrants, but they quite often have their partners come from India or Pakistan or Bangladesh to marry in. And Elaine's PhD has been very much looking at the experiences of these women, how the law can act as a barrier or the law can act as a facilitator, unfortunately most often a barrier, but also things about the actual complexities of their experience in the sense that it's not just the male adult partner who is perpetrating the abuse, that within the extended family and within a living situation where quite often they're living with mother-in-law, father-in-law, uncles, brothers, etc., there is a tolerance and support for this, and that part of the culture that they import from the Indian subcontinent of izzat and honour serves to keep them actually within an abusive relationship and also blame themselves for bringing dishonour upon the family. One key thing within this information, and the slides will be available, is that within Scotland, within the UK, arriving on a spousal visa, you have no recourse to public funds until you get your immigration status formalised. Now, it used to be that it was 2 years probationary period to get the right to remain, and they've moved it to 5 years. There is a provision that if you've experienced domestic abuse within that time, you can in fact leave and can access, I think, public funds, but you have to have 2 pieces of evidence to say that this abuse occurred. So there is some notion that the reporting has had to have happened at least twice, and hopefully with a couple of the stories you'll see, that's very difficult because there are language barriers, there's access to the police, there's a lack of understanding of what being a British citizen means or what being in Britain means in terms of human rights and access to support. And the women, certainly within this study, often had no knowledge of what they could and couldn't do, and were far more worried and far more persuaded that what their parents-in-law were saying, what their husband was saying, that if you complain, you'll be on the plane back to Pakistan tomorrow, and you can deal with what happens there. So, again, we have the nested ecological model, and things like race, ethnicity, xenophobia, the structures of our system very much impinge on an immigrant experience, and hopefully when you read it through, that will also make some sense. So in terms of the microsystem of the abuses that immigrant women were feeling, you know, they were strangled when he was drunk, physically beaten by mothers-in-law as well as adult partners, physically beaten by the husband, raped and sexually assaulted, and this was an area that wasn't easily defined as being abuse because they were married and there were expectations about what that meant. You know, and some things about, one of the women highlighted that for her, one of the issues was taking her scarf and strangling her with it, that it was almost so denigrating to her in terms of her choice of dress, etc., that there was a real disparaging comment within that. In terms of some of the barriers, often the women would talk about sort of the concept of izzat, the honour culture, the not bringing shame on your family or on your community. So even at a cultural, slightly broader level, it wasn't just within the family, there was a barrier to disclosing because they didn't want it to be seen that it was a problem of immigrants, that our culture, it's the violence is within our culture, not broader Scottish society. And to be fair, there are people within the Scottish society, the majority culture, who would quite like to say, oh, it's not a problem for the majority, it's a problem for the minority. It's people like them who have these cultural beliefs about the roles of women, not us. But bear in mind what you've just seen about the alcohol and abuse. I think that's nonsensical. The lack of service and not knowing anything about the country was really, really important. There was a misrepresentation of rights by perpetrators. And in some ways, there was an inappropriate response from some services. A little interesting point is in Scotland, we have a system now that if the police are routinely called to a domestic abuse call, they will remove the perpetrator. They'll take the perpetrator away, and it's understanding of the impact of moving women and children out of house. In migrant women, in the minority ethnic groups, they take the women away still because it's not about just her and her partner, it's the entire family, so they won't rehouse them. So she is then the problem again. So there's an interesting parallel. Again, if you look through, the impact in terms of the law dissuaded, by legal services to actually pursue any justice, lack of evidence, lack of access to services at a number of levels. Women from minority ethnic groups are disenfranchised. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop forward and just briefly talk about the parenting study. This was work done with criminal justice social workers in Scotland, and partly because going back to the beginning where we say we know that nothing works or that there's very little impact of traditional programmes, we decided to see if we could pair up domestic abuse programmes and parenting programmes. And this is from knowledge I have that often me as a father, and when I realise that I'm having an impact on my children and I look like my abusive father, that's often a tool, it's a hook. It's when I genuinely start engaging with change. It has been controversial. We decided to give Triple P a positive parenting approach, a strengths-based intervention to men convicted of domestic abuse. There were many issues about managing safety because of the potential use of the children and the potentially privileging knowledge so that mothers would perhaps then be in the position where father says, I've done a programme and now I know I'm a better parent than you. So we managed that through multi-agency working. What we ended up with was we did a study basically, and we've got a logic model sort of looking at the various different specified outcomes and outputs. And what we have is we've got slow recruitment but good retention. We've got attitudinal changes for the participants who've gone through the programme. We've got a shift in motivation to change. We did have one man further offend, but actually within the group we had that was probably lower than predicted and managed within the services anyway. And one thing that was good is we had enhanced disclosure in terms of risk and safety management. The key things I want to highlight, though, in terms of the impact of skilling people up in a strengths-based way and working with what the fathers wanted, was Mum is now saying, it's a blessing that he went. I couldn't cope. He would tell them to do something, they'd not do it. I'd tell them, they'd say no, we'd have a go at each other, he'd get up, get angry. And obviously, it was a point of conflict. Now, what she's saying is this particular parenting intervention gets fathers to challenge their automatic negative thoughts, their attributions as to bad behaviour in the children. They're doing it on purpose, they're doing it to wind me up. And that is the point we hoped would then maybe translate out to other things. And certainly for this participant, she's saying, we're talking more, he's talking more, he's understanding more, and he's recognising, hang on a minute, that's an automatic thought. And then thinking about what an automatic thought is, recognising it and dismissing it before any damage is done. So these men are starting to challenge their own thinking about their children, and I was delighted to see also about their partners. Okay? So he gets a bit upset. He's quick to anger and shout, but he's applied it. In terms of the dads, they were also saying that they found the programme content very important. The first participant is saying, it's very important for me and other people. Usually I don't bother about other people's points of view, but I don't want people to think he always shouts at the children, he's murder, he's doing this. I don't want to be like that. So he says he doesn't want to be like his father, he doesn't want to be seen as a poor father. It opened my eyes to the way you should be with your children, and the relationship would be about your children and things like that. It made me feel really guilty. I mean, this is something we did have to manage. There was a lot of guilt and shame about actually the realisation that their behaviours would obviously have had an effect on their children. But the fact at this point they were then having the skills and confidence to go and try out more positive parenting interactions with their children, and they were getting positive feedback about it, was very helpful. So one of the fathers said that he refused to think that he was neglecting his children because he'd exposed them to domestic abuse, but actually, having gone through the programme, he could understand it and he'd accepted it and felt he was doing something about it. But that message was quite a difficult one to handle. So there is something about how you handle that information. So the point I want to pull out here is, it was a learning experience for me, definitely. I knew I was at fault with my parenting, and lots of it. Drugs use, shouting and bawling in front of the children, insulting the children without realising it. Like when they spill a cup of juice and I'm saying, are you bloody stupid? And it's right away, I'm angry. What this guy goes on to say is, there was a section on automatic thoughts. That to me was like gold. That was something I'd suffered a long time in my life. We make up things we make up in our head and base on. If you're having an argument with your partner and they say something, your automatic thought is that they're accusing you or they're trying to upset you. I'd never heard that before. So one of the things we were hoping is that the challenge of the automatic thoughts in regard to the children's behaviour would translate out, and actually there was some evidence that exactly that was happening, that the men were going away more skilled to kind of reflect on their thoughts and think, there are other ways to do it. Our practitioners loved delivering the programme. They thought that parenting should be a core part of their work, that it was a really valuable programme. They thought it was very, very difficult, though, to add it on to their workloads, and I suspect many of you might be in a similar position. So coming back towards the end, this is the participants, our practitioner participants talking. Positive programme. There were a couple of guys that were really positive. The numbers were an issue, but it was positive. There was a lot of screening involved, so they selected the right people to go onto the programme, and that was very important. They had built up a relationship and knew a lot about the people before they started. There's an issue about respect within the programme, the strengths-based approach, the fact that it was an evening programme, it was a voluntary programme, it was informal, it was about parenting, it wasn't about domestic violence, so it wasn't about directly challenging or shaming individuals, and that was seen as important. There was a concept, we had pizza and food we gave to the participants because they'd come from work and they came and we gave them hot food and some drinks and things, and that was seen as very, very positive. Other people had said, oh, that was collusive, it was, we were handling it incorrectly. But actually, everybody involved in the programme had said the importance of treating the participants who were coming voluntarily to address some issues with respect, facilitating their attendance, thinking about them as people, having had a hard day at work, really, really mattered. It was nighttime. It was showing them respect for coming. I'll move from that. What do we need to think about ultimately to try and draw it together? And I appreciate I've talked very fast through many, many things. The idea is, though, that we do have challenges at a cultural, institutional, family and individual level. They all interlink, and it is these multiple social identities that make us the people we are, but also need to inform the interventions that need to be provided for us. So the idea is the sort of man, woman, Scottish, British, Asian, Chinese, Hong Kong. Which identities are important for you? How salient are they for you at all points? Which ones need to be addressed? Can you separate them out? Drinker, etc. My favourite model, we come back to an ESSED ecological model of interventions. It suggests that what we do need to be doing is challenge at a cultural level, challenge at a systems level, challenge healthcare, welfare, education, and access to those systems. They need to be made culturally sensitive, but they need to be appropriate for people with different social identities. So I suppose one key message I'd want you to take away is that, to me, culture is not necessarily about ethnicity. It is about social identity. And the subculture of substance misuse, drug use, drinking can equally disenfranchise people as a subculture of other in terms of minority ethnic identity. All of these things we have to address, otherwise we're not doing a good job. I think I'm going to stop relatively now, as I'm running out of time, and say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So we have time for questions and questions specifically directed at Professor Gilchrist for her presentation. Anybody? Esther? If you just briefly introduce yourself and ask your question.
All right. My name is Esther Erlings, and I just finished a PhD at one of the other universities in Hong Kong, Chinese University. What I wanted to ask is, you talked about the need for people to work with people with problems, if I can say problems, to really understand these people. And I was wondering to what extent you would find it necessary for these people to sort of belong to the same group, for example, to belong to the same ethnic group, or perhaps if we're talking about substance abuse, somebody who has experienced themselves.
There are two views, I suppose, within current practice within Scotland or within the UK, and certainly in America there's a predominant culture of putting people in a group for specialists. So you would have Black American groups for domestic abuse. You would have Hispanic groups for domestic abuse. And certainly at one point when I worked in the West Midlands, there was a culture of not putting one individual from any particular culture to be the only person in a group, so that because they would be seen as potentially being demonised within that group. My preferred view is I don't think that you should put all the same people in a group necessarily. I don't think it's required. I do think we need to be doing our work in a culturally sensitive manner. So that is about thinking about people, but protecting people from being demonised. So I wouldn't put one person of sort of deprived identities in a group, because there is a possibility for the rest of the group members to say, well, I'm not as bad as them. And oh, it's a problem there, and focus around issues to do with, oh, a culture we don't understand and something like that. But actually, I think mixed groups are really, really helpful, because the problems are shared problems. We have different identities, but actually, for many of the men in the groups I'm talking about, the key problem that we're trying to address within that programme is about the domestic abuse. And the fact it translates out slightly differently if you're a drug user, or if you're a substance misuser, or you're from a minority community, or you have specific cultural beliefs, is just a pathway, but it's not maybe the core issue. I mean, obviously, chaotic drink and drugs users can't necessarily get involved in the programme straight away.
Any other questions? Do you want to press the mic button, please, so that we can get it on the video?
You talked about, it's Polly Radcliffe from King College. You talked about the traditional programme that some of the men had done. I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about what that is, really.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know to what extent people use a psychoeducational kind of Duluth-based intervention, 26 weeks programme here, but certainly in years gone by, I used to deliver a programme, and it was very much based on the Duluth model from the USA. It was based on a concept that domestic abuse arises primarily from patriarchal structures and is a problem of male identity within Western sort of cultures, and that actually by explaining to men within a programme where their cultural identity comes from, by challenging that, by holding them accountable, that we could enact change. Now, sometimes it was possible to do some of that. Some of the issues, and I swear I have done this myself, is that it was quite shaming. It was very, people became quite defensive within the programme. So we would always deliver with 2 women and 1 man in the group. And that was so that there wasn't 1 woman in a group of men being demonised. It was quite difficult to avoid the idea that as a woman you were challenging men, and that, you would say that you're a woman, it's all about men's being problems, or indeed when the concept of power and control, which was one of the core concepts within Duluth, that domestic abuse arises from male entitlement or beliefs of entitlement to be in control and having power and unequal power. Many of the men did not feel powerful. And, obviously it may be that they were using abuse to reenact that power because it fitted with cultural beliefs about men should be in power. But because they did come from disadvantaged groups, many of them were from minority ethnic cultures, and often they were drinking, they actually had an experience of being powerless in their relationships as well. They didn't believe themselves to be powerful. There was a huge amount of sexual jealousy and infidelity, and the men were saying that because their partners potentially were more verbally fluent and potentially they felt more attractive, they were having to manage this. So there are elements of power and control within that. But the message is that purely through a psychoeducational group, by exposing people to information, they would be able to take this on, apply it to themselves, and then behave differently, I think, is quite challenging. And I think actually talking to Michael Paymar, he would say the same thing now, that actually it's probably not enough to tell people, here are the roots of the problem, that you need to help people actually change, enact that change.
Edward.
Yeah, I'm very interested to address the issues related to in-law conflict, and especially that could be representing the extended family's influence on the IPV. So the reason why I mentioned this is because I did have some studies in Hong Kong and in Chinese families that the relationship between the so-called the couple and nuclear family is quite close with the extended family. So basically, on the positive end, the in-laws, the grandparents, they are available to help take care of the grandchildren. But on the negative side, they're too close and it could be intrusive to that family. So this I would consider could be quite a kind of a dimension reflecting the culture issues, because basically the in-laws is bringing in the family culture, traditions, and then always that could be quite abusive to the women. So, so when I learned about this, because on the contrary, when I compare the in-law relationship in the United States, of course they have in-law, and in-law conflict is something very common, and but because they are living apart, so probably the in-laws are in another state or whatever, so it doesn't really affecting daily living arrangement. So in your context, how would you describe that the extended family, especially those in-laws, are they close to the nuclear family? And how would you describe that? Do you consider this could be better?
There are many answers to that one. But one thing, I suppose, if we talk within the indigenous populations, there are 3 examples I think I'd like to briefly talk about. We have an experience that actually the people who move in Britain are the higher social classes who have access to money. That many of the people who earn less money actually live very close to their families. They live and die within 3 miles of where they were born. So whilst they don't live within the extended family is likely to be quite close. So it's quite different from the US. It's not quite the same as Asian culture, but actually bear in mind that we also have a number of different cultures. So for some, certainly our minority ethnic women, they would definitely be likely to be living within extended families. There's also, if I give an example, I actually did an assessment with a woman who had experienced a high level of domestic abuse from a medic, so a very highly respected consultant. They, in fact, had been living within their families' larger accommodations. So they lived in a huge basement apartment, but in part of the culture. This was a very middle-class woman who, after I think about 8 years of abuse and 4 children, was finally able to go to court and come to see me to do an assessment. And she was saying that, you know, her partner used to force her to engage in sex and drink and things. She would be beaten. She would be trying to escape from the basement apartment to her in-laws' house, and they would be saying, "Oh, you know, it's only when he's been drinking. You know, you're privileged. You live in a beautiful place. What are you doing?" So there was a similar amount, you know, of actual collusion, even within families where that wouldn't have been expected. And then the final point, another woman I did years and years ago, I was doing some work with in terms of assessments for court, in terms of child protection. And she was saying that, you know, she had 7 children, I think it was, and she'd been with her partner for 8 years, and she had experienced extreme high levels of abuse and had gone to shelters and come back and shelters and come back. And she was explaining to me that her mother was saying, "But he's the father of your children," and came out with the phrase, "You made your bed, lie on it. So, you know, he's the father of your children, you should go back." They didn't live together, but there was equal amount of, like, you know, collusion in terms of with the perpetrator. Now, it turns out that the children were, in fact, all of them the result of rape. So she was, in a number of different ways, living with the consequences of abuse, and her family was saying, "Well, he's the father of your children, go back." You know, so I think there are differences in terms of the living arrangements and how, you know, how closely people see that culture is coming forward. But actually, even at a distance and with different family relations, it's equally problematic, or could be equally positive or problematic.